I'm Dan Rundy. I'm a senior vice president here at CSIS, and I hold the Schreier chair. We're having a conversation about reforming assistance, fixing American foreign aid in a world of great power competition. I think we're having this conversation at a relevant moment. I think there was this election thing that happened yesterday. I don't know if anyone was reading the newspapers, but I think it's also relevant because I think what I say is it's not your grandparents' developing world. It's richer, freer, more capable, and with a lot more options. And if we don't meet the hopes and aspirations of developing countries, they're going to take their business to the Chinese. And so I think that we have to think differently about the world that we're in. We've also got a lot of challenges that come from the developing world. There's radicalism and narco-funded criminal gangs often live in fragile states and make fragile states happen. You've got challenges of uncontrolled migration, which is growing. I think you've got the issue of increased pandemics. I think every 2 or 3 years, like clockwork, a funny named disease that we can't pronounce shows up and is a massive threat, and that happens because of urbanization, changes in animal husbandry, and changes in the amounts of people flying on airplanes. It means that we're going to have funny named pandemics like clockwork. They're just going to happen. I think there's some significant thinking in the administration about how we might think differently about assistance. I think it's the right time to be asking. It's legitimate to ask hard questions about assistance. It's legitimate to go back and ask some basic questions like, does assistance work? How do we use assistance in a period? How do we compete against China with our assistance? How do we work with allies? How do we use it to deal with some of the most pressing challenges that we face? These are all legitimate questions. I do think, though, that it's going to be just like I think we need a strong military budget. I think we need a 355-ship Navy. I think we're going to need a fully funded soft power capacity. I don't think if we've got champagne aspirations, I don't think we can do it on a beer budget. So let's start with that. I've got some really smart friends and colleagues who are going to help me answer some of these questions. And I think also and I'm doing this in the context of, I think there's sort of an open, it's sort of openly known, there's been some thinking in the administration about this and some initial thoughts, and so I think we wanted to provide some outside expert support for this. I want the Trump administration to succeed. I always want the United States of America to succeed, and so I think this is being done in the context of that as well. So thanks. So I'm not going to introduce each of my friends, but I'll briefly introduce them, and then we're just going to jump into it. So I'm going to first start with my friend Rick Olson, who's Ambassador Rick Olson, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Pakistan and is an affiliate here at CSIS. We're very fortunate to have Ambassador Olson with us here at CSIS. So Ambassador Olson, one of the things that is being pondered right now is the issue of what do we do about folks that aren't our friends? How should we think about giving assistance to countries that aren't necessarily our friends? I think there's been some frustration, understandably, in the administration that we ask folks to vote with us on things like Israel, and we give them aid, and we say to ourselves, I'm giving you guys all this foreign aid, and then you turn around and kick us in the shins in the UN and vote the wrong way on all sorts of stuff. Look, Ambassador Olson, I'm pro-Israel, but I think it's very difficult in my mind to get people to change their votes based on foreign assistance. So Ambassador Olson, what do you think about that?
Yeah, Dan, I agree with your analysis. I mean, I first experienced this when I was a junior political officer in East Africa in the 1980s during the Cold War. And it came, one of the things that struck us, I was in Kampala, but the fact was that under Ambassador Kirkpatrick, there was an effort to sort of tighten down on countries that were not voting in the same way we were. And one of the striking examples was the case of Kenya, which actually voted against us quite a bit in the UN, or at least did not vote with us as much as we would like. And yet we had a very positive relationship with Kenya, including military access and all kinds of economic relationships. And it, basically, I think what emerged was that for the Kenyans, it was their voting against us in the UN gave them a certain amount of cover within the G77 and other groups and the non-aligned movement in those days to allow them to have a more strategic relationship with the United States. And I think that continues to play out. I mean, it's true, for example, this is not an assistance question, but let's look in the Middle East right now. If you, one of the things that's been striking in foreign policy terms is the emergence of a tacit alliance between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Israel, of all countries, with the Israeli Prime Minister actually stopping in Oman recently, and with the beginnings of some more significant military quiet relationships. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are never going to vote with us at the UN on the question of Palestine. It's just not going to happen. And so I think we need to be thinking in terms of the overall strategic coherence of our of our foreign policy, including our assistance policy, and thinking about what are the strategic assets that we have, the costs and benefits, and an overall strategic picture.
Okay. Ambassador, let's operate on the assumption that General Assembly votes are important symbolically or in some way. What do you say if you're the U.S. ambassador to the UN and you say, gosh darn it, I'm really annoyed because I really want folks to vote our way. Why won't they vote our way? What's your response if someone came to you who is the U.S. UN and said, I'm really annoyed and I'm really tempted to cut their aid to show them who's boss?
Well, I think that we would have to again look at the overall strategic equation with the country in question and what we're seeking to accomplish in that country and what kind of broad relationship we have. But let's start with
think about it in the bigger picture. We think about the bigger relationship.
In the bigger picture. But let's start with the fact that for most countries, votes in the General Assembly have in fact been symbolic exercises. The General Assembly's decisions, resolutions don't carry any legal weight. The Security Council is a different issue. And so it is a relatively cost-free environment to exercise their political proclivities and to maintain whatever sort of public stance they want to maintain in terms of their stated foreign policy. So there may be some countries that are going to be particularly susceptible to pressure on the question of assistance. In practical terms, I think it's going to be a very small universe of probably sub-Saharan African countries.
And only a subset of those. They'll say, I'm going to go to the Chinese, thank you very much.
Exactly. Countries that are somehow more dependent on the U.S. than on other donors. And who feel that their domestic politics and international coalition building will allow them to shift on critical issues for us.
Yeah, I think this Ambassador, I think this issue of leveraging our foreign assistance and we're going to somehow get folks to change their foreign policy. I think there's a very small universe of countries where total foreign assistance, not just U.S. foreign assistance, is more than, say, 5% of the GNP of a country. If you wanted to use a number that was sort of a big number, I think Afghanistan's in that category, probably Haiti. I think Honduras, for example, which is a very poor country, I think it's less than 5%. So I don't think if we went to Honduras and we're going to cut your aid, that may be, I think there are other things that we have, other levers, but I would just say, I think in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, I think most of those countries now, their number one trading partner is China, so I'm not sure they're necessarily, so I think you're right, that I think that's a shrinking pool. It's sort of gone the way of the Edsel or the 8-track tape. That's sort of an old think from another time. But the other reason, Ambassador, I wanted you to be on this panel is the issue of Pakistan. So Pakistan is an example of a country that's kind of a friend, kind of not a friend. I don't know how to, I'm sure you'll have a diplomat. I like Pakistan. I've been to Pakistan. I think we have strategic reasons. You and I both agree. We have reasons to be in Pakistan. We need to have we need to have an adult relationship with Pakistan. It's going to be 400 million people, but we've had complicated relationships. So it's on some level, it's a partner, and on other levels, we've got a lot of conflict with Pakistan. And there have been discussions about, I'm going to cut their assistance or I'm not going to cut their assistance. So I want if you could just spend a minute on, let's use Pakistan as a case study of assistance and how we, just talk a little bit about, have we used assistance to either get them to do something diplomatically or security-wise that they wouldn't otherwise have done? Does that stuff work with a country like Pakistan?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to have a punchy bumper sticker for, how we characterize the U.S.-Pakistan relationship.
No.
It's a little too complicated for that. But people talk about, Pakistan being a frenemy, and, we can use that for these purposes. We have, the thing to remember about Pakistan is that the relationship and the assistance levels have been a roller coaster or a sine wave or whatever cliche you want, up and down over the course of the 70-year relationship. And I happened to be ambassador there at a time when we were sort of nearing the peak levels of some of this assistance. It was
Big money.
It was big money. It was during the time of Kerry Lugar-Berman, which was authorized at the level of $7.5 billion. Against an economy of roughly $250 billion. So I guess what is that? I'm not good at math, maybe like 3%.
Yeah, 3%, but that's
Yeah.
real money compared to whatever we're doing now.
Yeah, and it has now been cut, most of it, at least the FMF and CSF, not entirely on the ESF side. This was all done to effect a shift in Pakistani strategic thinking, to bring about in Pakistan an alignment on our goals, principally with regard to Afghanistan, which is essentially to get them to stop funding and supporting in other ways the Taliban, and to make a more productive partner, and also to allow their territory to be used for the transit of goods into Afghanistan. Afghanistan being a landlocked country, if you want to fight there, you have to go through someone else. Pakistan is really the only country that we could go through, except maybe in the northern countries. So the latter part worked. I mean, we certainly had a robust set of lines of communication, ground and air, through Pakistan, and that part was fine. But in terms of affecting the strategic shift, I think all of you would agree that it has not happened. Pakistan has never been prepared to renounce what it sees as its strategic interest in shaping outcomes in Afghanistan, preventing their sort of somewhat fictionalized version of Indian dominance of Afghanistan, and their tool for doing that. And most of all, they fear a complete collapse into chaos in Afghanistan should we leave, which they always consider a possibility. And the tool they have at their hand is the Afghan Taliban, which is an organization that they have basically nurtured and supported over the years. So that's an unpleasant reality, and we weren't able to affect it either by ramping up our assistance in large ways, or frankly, I would argue, by cutting it off.
Okay, so let me ask you a leading question. So I think there have been 6 million girls that have gone through the school system in Afghanistan. It's got a somewhat functioning democracy. There's been significant infrastructure improvements, major improvements in health. Is this the time to pull the plug and go wobbly on Afghanistan?
No, absolutely not.
That's what I
I mean, the worst, and let me say this, the Trump administration has made it a central element of its policy, and I think this is the correct approach, to seek a political settlement in Afghanistan. But that means that only works if you have leverage, and the leverage means that we have to continue to support the government of Afghanistan robustly with civilian assistance. It also means we have to continue our military commitment. Were we to pull the plug right now, it would make it much harder for our diplomats to actually negotiate a peaceful end to the settlement, which everyone has agreed is what we want to seek.
I think it would be a catastrophe. I think it would be immoral. I think it would be a disaster. So, Ambassador, just so there's a donor conference coming up in Geneva for Afghanistan. You may or may not be following the finer points of this, but if you were the U.S. going into that, what would your hopes be that the U.S. position would be going into that donor conference?
Well, I think that, in terms of the donor conference, I think the messaging should largely be the same as at the Brussels conference in 2015, which is that we are prepared to stay the course, that Afghanistan has made, in fact, substantial progress, especially in health and education indices, and that we need to be committed to Afghanistan, not just today and tomorrow, but over the long term, in terms of especially civilian assistance. I mean, the lessons of Afghan history are pretty clear. Afghanistan does not have a self-sustaining economy and probably never has, but certainly not in recent times. And governments have collapsed when foreign assistance dried up.
Okay, thank you. So I think one of our messages for our friends in television land is, don't go wobbly on Afghanistan. We're making progress, and we should go in and continue to support the Afghan cause. I certainly believe that. I'm glad, Ambassador, you agree with me. Okay, Nilmini Rubin, thank you for being here. Ambassador, so Nilmini is an Executive Vice President at Tetra Tech, a very fine development consulting firm, and it has other business lines as well. I would say many of the most significant legislation that came out of the last several years before she went into the private sector in foreign assistance and foreign policy that Congressman Royce did, Nilmini Rubin was one of the quarterbacks behind that, or one of the major actors, major positive development legislation. And she was also you were a White House staffer in Bush 43. And were you at the State Department as well?
Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
You were also at Senate Foreign Relations Committee as well. So you've had a really wonderful Washington career. I'm thrilled that you're on this, and you're also an affiliate at CSIS. So this is no coincidence. So thank you. Okay, so Nilmini, so just a couple of things. There was an election yesterday, so I'm going to ask you to just comment on that. I recall, we didn't have a chance to talk about this beforehand. I seem to recall you did a major review when you worked for Senator Lugar on the multilateral development banks. And so if you'd also be willing to comment a little bit on that. But I think specifically with the change in the Congress, let's operate as if Chairman Engel's going to be the new chairman of the Foreign Affairs, and Anita Lowey's going to have the Hal Rogers check writing job in the appropriate subcommittee. And so are there deals to be had? Because one of the reasons I wanted to convene this meeting was it seems to me that there's energy in the executive branch to make changes to development given the changed landscape. We now have some new players on the legislative side. I think there's a deal to be had, and so I'd be interested in some of the components of that, and I'd also be interested in your thoughts about the MDBs, among other things.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan. I don't get to call the quarterback very often, so I appreciate that.
You were a fabulous quarterback and did some really important things while you were on the Hill.
So, great timing to do this the day after the election, because we actually know what the landscape looks like. It was kind of like an elementary school, game where everyone won yesterday. And so we're like, we are looking at a really completely different scenario. And you mentioned, Mr. Engel and Ms. Lowy. There's going to be a lot of additional players that are new to foreign affairs and international finance that we're going to need to educate and have advocacy with to ensure that they know all of the issues with the multilateral development banks and the IMF. It's back when I worked for Senator Lugar, we did a series of hearings. We had 6 hearings on the development banks themselves that led up to a report on the international financial institutions, a call for change, and led to recommendations for that cycle of capital increases. Well, we're looking at another cycle of capital increases now. And the Trump administration actually requested a huge amount of money for the capital increase for the multilateral development banks. So those MDBs are like the World Bank and the other regional development banks, the IDB, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the African Development Bank. And the Trump administration supported a $7.5 billion capital increase. I mean, and that was big. That was a really big deal. It's 50% more than the Obama administration's call for a capital increase. So it's a huge increase. And to get that through, to get those funds appropriated by Congress, it's going to take a huge amount of education. In this, we've all seen a lot of campaign ads over the last few weeks. Like, I'm pretty sure none of them mention the multilateral development banks. And so this has not been a pressing issue for any member. And so we'll have to explain to them why it's important, and it is really important. If the U.S. does step back from the multilateral development banks, other countries will step in. Other countries want to increase their voting share in these institutions. They want to take our place. And if we did step back, whether it's from the subsidized windows of those development banks, which is where most of the capital increase money would go to, or the main part of the banks, it would be a real loss for the U.S. It would take away our ability to influence them and drive them to what our goals are. And that's really important. China has been making the case at the World Bank that they want the World Bank to engage on the Belt and Road Initiative. And we need to have a really strong vision for what we want the World Bank to do. So it's not to just say no, but it's to say, let's do this other thing. And right now it's hard for us. We don't have a USED confirmed at the World Bank right now, so we don't have a strong advocate in there, even though there's really great staff that are carrying water for the U.S. It is important to have someone confirmed and sitting in the chair, so that is it is a challenge. And it's important we don't step away from these institutions, because the United States already made the mistake of not being involved in the Asian infrastructure in investment bank, and we're not at the table there trying to influence it. That we can't step away from the table on the banks where we clearly have a leadership interest.
Okay, so let me just ask a leading question about that. So if somebody had the dumb idea of saying, hey, I want to sell America's shares and have someone else buy them out of one of the regional development banks, would you agree that's a colossally stupid idea? I'm just asking, just theoretically.
Yeah. Not putting words in. No, yeah. Given that we have U.S. goals, like we have national security interests in these banks, to leave them for what would be a pittance of money would be selling out our own interests. We have to think long-term. International development is a long-term game, and we can't be playing checkers while China's playing chess.
So Nilmani, you were one of the architects of the Electrify Africa Act, which I think was very interesting because it was a form of enlightened self-interest. It was about there's a massive gap of power in Africa, but there was also a commercial opportunity for Buy American and Hire American products and services, and for American jobs for Americans. Are there other opportunities like that? Are there other sectors or other regions where we might take that approach that was a good idea in the Obama administration that might be something the Trump administration might do in some other part of the world? I think one of the prompts of the Electrify Africa Act is, I believe, Mike Froman went to Africa and realized that much of the power sector was being delivered by China, and that was a prompt for it. So I think there was, in addition to doing the right thing and meeting SDG 7 and in sub-indicator 121 of the Sustainable Development Goals or whatever it was, there was also great power competition that was in our interest. So is there some other sector or opportunity that's on your horizon that the U.S. government ought to think about that we might think about at this period?
From a congressional perspective, the prompt was really a joint trip with Roy's staff and Engel's staff, where we wanted to do work on trade capacity building to increase trade between the U.S. and Africa, and realized you couldn't do it without power. So it was actually coming from a commercial interest. So instead of writing a deep trade capacity building bill, we came back and wrote the Electrify Africa Act together in front of one computer. And it was from a Roy staffer perspective, a Republican perspective, this market-based approach was really critical. It wasn't about us throwing money at countries. It was about how to crowd in the private sector to develop public goods. And there are absolutely other sectors and regions where this can be important. We chose electricity because it is the juice of modernity. You can't have anyone in the modern world without having access to electricity. So the next piece where this could completely apply is on internet access. Internet access is the juice of the information age. That's where we are right now. And half the world still doesn't have internet access. So it's a perfect, actually almost everything in that bill could be transferred into the internet sector really easily. Electrify Africa Act started as an Africa-focused piece, but it doesn't need to be focused on just Africa. You could have an Electrify Asia, or what the administration is looking at with Asia Edge, like a deep crowding in of the private sector for electricity in Asia. There are millions of people in Asia without access to electricity. So there's certainly a lot of different sectors and regions where you can take the approach, but it's a really basic approach of how do we improve the policy model? How do we bring in the private sector? And how do we have unity of purpose of our government? It's not a whole of government. You don't need the entire government in every meeting to do everything. But how do you have this clear purpose that this is what the government is driving towards and crowd people in? I think that that was the kind of the secret sauce of Electrify Africa and Power Africa.
So Congressman Engels was very supportive of Electrify
Yes.
Africa. So the good news is he's now probably going to be the chair of the committee. So he and his staff are probably going to be open to, let's reprise what we did successfully with you, Congressman Engel, several years ago in the Obama administration. Couldn't we bring this to other sectors or other regions?
I would hope that they would be, I don't want to speak for Mr. Engel, but they would be open to it. I mean, he was absolutely pivotal in writing the bill and getting it passed.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Nomini. Thanks. Okay, Lester Munson, you were the top staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We both served together in the Bush administration. You're an amigo de la casa here at CSIS. You're a friend of the family. Thank you very much for being here. And you're super tall, so I always say you're the biggest lobbyist in Washington.
Do I get one of those lapel pins?
No,
for the
well,
Amigo thing?
I think everyone should get one of these lapel pins. This is Armistice. This is to remember Armistice Day, and it's the 100th anniversary. So, actually, I wish we had one for everybody here, but if I had one, I'd give you one. So, how about that? But Lester, thanks for being here. You really understand the intersection of development and diplomacy. And I would also, let me come back to the question I asked Ambassador Olson, about this issue about giving assistance to, let's call it non-friends. Because I think this is a debate that happens on the Hill all the time, saying, why should we give money to Pakistan? We talked about Pakistan. Sometimes it's, why should we give money to Egypt? Or why should we give money to the West Bank Gaza government? Or why? So could you just comment from a Hill perspective on this? Because I think this is something that we've collectively grappled with for a long time, so it's a legitimate question.
Well, I think it's a great. I was hoping for a leading question where I could just say
I'm
yes.
gonna warm up to it.
Okay.
I haven't gotten there yet. The caffeine is dropping off, and I need to titrate the caffeine. So.
We're all hoping you do. So I think that's a great question. It's a question of context, and this administration, I think, is a little schizophrenic on the context it provides the Hill in terms of the foreign assistance zone. On the budget requests, we have the kind of the surreal Dadaist request that goes up to the Hill that's completely absurd and not connected to reality. And then there are other parts of the administration that do a terrific job of engaging on things like the BUILD Act and some of the very fine things that Mark Green is doing at USAID. So I think on the Hill sees two different faces from this administration. And so this notion that we should cut aid to countries that aren't our friends kind of fits into that first category. What we really should focus on is the real context for the 150 account. What's the overall purpose of not only our development budget, but also the money we spend on diplomacy and the money we spend on defense? There seems to be an emerging consensus from folks on the Hill and some in the administration that we're in a great power competition with China. That is it's in the title of this discussion today. That's a great jumping off point to contextualize these like a real robust international affairs budget that is going to it's not in the context of, are we aiding people who aren't our friends? Are we spending money that advances our interests and our values? Do we have programs and policies that provide an alternative to what China is doing in the Indo-Pacific in a way that benefits the United States and our real allies? That's the context that we should be looking at that question. And at places like this and other places in town, we have to recontextualize the question into what is the U.S. strategic interest? I think it's exactly what Ambassador Olson said.
So I want to compliment the Trump administration. I think their national security strategy was excellent. I think it was definitely in the realm of sort of other national security strategies of the past. I think what we're missing is an international economic strategy to fit how we think about our assistance. And so I think one of the things that's missing is that. But I do think that you're absolutely right. We need to make the case for assistance in the context of great power competition. I think the administration does a great job of saying we need a 355-ship Navy. I'm the first person to say, amen. I think it should be 355 or higher. And I think there's a fabulous new book by John Lehman about the Cold War, and we're going to come back to that in a minute, about the Cold War and great power competition in the Cold War and assistance and power in the Cold War when we get to my friend Rich Bissell. But we had a big Navy, and we used it as a deterrence. And I think we need not only to have a 355-ship Navy, we need to have a fully funded military, but we need a fully funded soft power capability. We're going to be able to kill our way out of I don't think we're necessarily going to be able to kill our way out of criminally funded gangs. I don't think we're going to be able to kill our way out of uncontrolled migration. I don't think we're going to be able to kill our way out of any number of pandemics. We're going to need a variety of other tools and other instruments. And so if we're going to underfund those while also funding sort of just the military side, it's not going to work. So Lester, I agree with that. I guess, could you talk a little bit about, in your mind, some of the legislative opportunities? You were saying beforehand about, I think, just talk what the last 2 years have been about, and maybe what the opportunities might be about over the next couple of years.
Right. So I think with the Democrats taking over in the House, we actually, it can be a very good step for what we're talking about. In the last 2 years, we've been worried about maintaining the 150 account, about maintaining a robust international affairs budget, a toolkit for the administration. We should always be concerned about that, but we can kind of move that down a step or two on our priority list, I think. And there have also been a number of authorization bills and reform bills. Nilmany was instrumental in many of them that advanced certain sectors of foreign assistance, whether it was food or water or reauthorizing PEPFAR, other things. Those were important to the sustaining the budget concept. I think we can take the next step now and look for common ground between the administration, Democrats on the Hill, Republicans on the Hill, and look at the great power competition as a way to provide a new architecture for our foreign assistance. There's already work being done at USAID on this issue. It needs to spread over to the State Department and to other places and be brought together and provide a rationale that can be explained to key members in both parties. One of the great things that happened yesterday, I think, a little sad for the Republicans who lost, but there were some terrific Democrats who did great jobs in the Obama administration who are now members of Congress. Tom Malinowski, Alyssa Slotkin. There's folks from the CIA, folks who served in uniform in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a new generation of folks on the Hill who are going to be a really important voice as we develop this new approach over the next couple of years.
Okay, so just thinking about some of the personalities on the Hill, I'm thinking about potentially a potential Chair Engel, a potential subcommittee chair at Lowy, some of the changes on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Are there some opportunities in particular that just come to mind just thinking about some of the personalities and some of their priorities?
Well, I think look at some of the election results from yesterday. You saw governorships flip from Republican to Democrat in Wisconsin and Michigan. Those were key states for President Trump 2 years ago. They're going to be even more important in 2 years. That's where the real battle is going to be fought. As we think about these issues, how are they going to play in Wisconsin and Michigan? How do you go explain to the Wisconsin voter why this if it comes up, why does this matter? Why is it important that we do this? Both Democrats and Republicans should be thinking about that question. I think there's a real opportunity here to develop a new consensus on a way forward.
I'm in agreement. Thank you very much. Okay, so Rich Bissell, you were the head of policy planning at USAID at the end of the Reagan administration and the beginning of Bush 41. You were a senior executive at the World Bank Group for a period of time, and then you had a really interesting career at the National Academy of Science running their international programs. You're also affiliated with CSIS. We're lucky to have you, and you've been a longtime friend and colleague of mine. And when I first met you, you talked about how we thought about foreign assistance during the Cold War, and that we looked at it through the lens of great power competition at the time. So I know that is one of the animating forces that's pushing the Trump administration to rethink assistance. So I wanted you just to reflect a little bit about your past lives and how we thought about foreign assistance during the Cold War and what lessons that might mean for this new period of great power competition now.
Thanks, Dan. So it's a little bit hard to boil down an incredible...
in 3 minutes or less.
I understand that. Boil down a fascinating 45 years of the Cold War into 3 minutes. But Washington suffers from historical amnesia and often forgets that we developed an incredible toolbox based upon foreign assistance that was really a product of experimentation from 1945 on that turned out to be indispensable, not just in the immediate containment of the Soviet Union, which is what U.S. policy was for many years, but the eventual demise of the Soviet Union. And I thought I'd just capture it in 4 basic ideas, which are some of which are relevant for the forward-looking issues we have strategically, and some are probably not. But I think it's important to understand what they were anyway. So the first was the economic assistance that the United States and its allies provided to the countries on the periphery of the Soviet Union. And I say the periphery very specifically because the Soviet Union was a land-based expansionist power, and therefore it would look at the countries on its periphery as places where they could try to expand their presence and their control. And so from the Marshall Plan on, and the Marshall Plan was quite controversial when created. Now we look back on it and think it's apple pie and motherhood. But it was incredibly controversial to put in place something that committed what were seen as massive American funds to a bunch of countries that should have been able to, people thought, do it on their own, which they clearly couldn't, because it was important, first of all, to stabilize the countries, because if they were destabilized, it opened for room for the communist parties and for the Soviet Union to have a presence. And then secondly, to move into economic growth. And that sequence was seen as absolutely essential, and it was first, of course, principally American funding, and then later, quite brilliantly, we evolved a set of international institutions which could pick up, and through burden sharing and so forth, the World Bank, the Fund, the regional banks, a whole host of institutions that actually became crucial and continue to the present day, but are kind of cast in the shadows because it's not recognized what a key role that they did play. So that's the first area. The second area, which I think is very important to remember, is what Dan would call soft power, which is the challenging the Soviet economic model. Now, I'll express a lot of frustration. In my graduate work, I did a lot of work on Soviet economics, all of which I threw out in the trash in 1990. But it was, believe it or not, up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was seen as a very viable alternative. And it was in the economics field, it was very important for seen as that the United States go out and find ways to demonstrate that there was a better model based on free markets rather than central command economies. And this was something that occasioned a lot of investment. It happened later when, in the 60s, when Cuba was, which was not a target of the Soviet Union, it fell into their lap. But the Alliance for Progress was created to identify an alternative way of achieving economic growth, and that was seen as very important. Part of that, which is a tool that we often forget, is that during that period up into the 1980s, that USAID was bringing 20,000 students a year to the United States, primarily to study economics and technical fields. And professionals.
From where? From the Soviet Union?
No. From these other
periphery
countries, from the developing countries. And it was to help to give them the tools and the long-term linkages with the United States that you'll still see to the present day if you go into countries and ask the background of people who were cabinet members and so forth. So many of them did actually have their training USAID paid for in the United States. The third area, which I think we sometimes forget about because it also is now considered routine, is the whole democracy and governance sector. It was only with the breakdown of the Soviet leadership in the late 70s, and you may not even remember the names of the Soviet leaders, they were so undistinguished. But it was clear that there was a rot at the top of the system. And so in 1982, President Reagan launched Project Democracy as a way of saying, actually, there is a way if, in fact, the Soviet Union, the Soviet people are looking for an alternative, and they clearly were. They were very unhappy. And as well as the satellite countries in Eastern Europe, they needed to be given alternatives. And so you had the creation out of that, for instance, things like the National Endowment for Democracy, the IRI, the IDI, the CIPE, which John Sullivan can talk about, who's back in the back of the room, the International Foundation for Electoral Support. These were all created in the early 80s as a way to create a toolbox that would morph, interestingly, not simply, I mean, it had a key role in terms of creating a global tide of democracy, but it then morphed into the whole area of democracy and governance and anti-corruption, which was crucial to giving people in developing countries the opportunity to have better, more honest and effective government. So that was the third area that was very crucial during the Cold War. The fourth area I would just identify, which is not talked about much, is the whole area of security assistance. Much of that was considered classified at the time. It involved the arms sales that came from the U.S., the IMET programs, which ensured that we created linkages at the personnel level with military across the world so that they could use the equipment and to become more effective in ensuring their own national security. The Economic Support Fund and contingency funds were considered essential tools by the State Department to be able to not create long-term programs, but to create those short-term support to a government that was under challenge, or that we wanted to really bring on board our side, and also as payment for base rights. We don't talk about that a lot today. We're not out opening up bases generally. It may become an issue in Asia, if in fact we identify the Chinese as serious strategic problems. So these were all crucial, and they worked because there was a coordinating element. That is that particularly during the 80s that I'm most familiar with, is that the National Security Council saw a role for itself to ensure that as an issue came up, that you got the people from DOD and Department of State and Commerce and USAID and USIA, which sadly enough has now been abolished, into the same room and pull together the tools that were needed to address the immediate problem. I'll just stop there. I think that was 3 minutes.
So thank you, Rich. I have 2 points. One is I want you to just reflect on the issue of science, technology, and innovation. I was saying earlier, my theory of change is we've got 100 developing countries. 30 are, in essence, fragile and conflict-affected states, and we're kind of stuck with those for the next 40 or 50 years. They require kind of a combination of diplomacy, development, security, and the problems are at root political, and those are going to be really intractable and hard. And then we got 70 countries that are going to make it. These countries are going to become OECD countries. They're going to become rich. They're going to become middle-income countries. Those countries, as they move up, they want infrastructure, they want trade, they want investment, and they covet, and I use that word specifically, they want to have a Silicon Valley of their own. They want a Research Triangle Park of their own. When developing countries put together a science strategy for their country, especially if they're poor, what they really are reflecting are sort of the deepest hopes and aspirations of the transformation of their country. Could you just spend a minute reflecting about science, technology, and innovation as it relates to sort of our attractiveness or our soft power for us?
Sure, and this is really a taking off point for one of the great differences between what we experienced in the Cold War and what we're experiencing today. And that is the third industrial revolution. And that really took off, as you know, in the late 80s into the 90s and continues to accelerate in terms of miniaturizing and decentralizing technology so that it can be adapted and utilized anywhere in the world by the poorest people. There are several billion Facebook users in the world, including in very poor countries, as long as you have a link and a smartphone. So what's happened with science and technology is it's had this effect of changing people's lives in a very fundamental way. Secondly, science technology has changed the nature of communication. When I think back what, for instance, we were able to achieve in Project Democracy, and we thought it was revolutionary to have a fax machine, if you remember what they were. And to be able to actually send.
Sorry, what is a fax machine?
Yes, I know. But luckily, Solidarity in Poland had a fax machine, and so it opened up communications to the West in a very unprecedented way. But that is, as you know, is just, now centuries away from in terms of the new technologies that exist today. So that's really the first thing I just mentioned about the science and technology issue. The second is that it has driven a globalization at several different levels. Clearly at the corporate level, with the scale and power and the wealth of our global corporations today have created a whole different set of dynamics that government may or may not control. And we're seeing a power struggle right now involving, European governments and the Google and Microsoft and others in terms of who really has the final word. But it's also created massive global supply chains. And the Chinese figured out what those meant much sooner than we did. Such that today, well, let me take it the reverse way. If in fact the Soviet Union during its time had decided to cut off trade externally, we would have yawned. I mean, it was not a player. Whereas today, there are people quaking at the idea that there actually may be some longer-term severance of Chinese trade in any number of areas. And I'm not just talking about whether you're going to get your iPhone, but there's a lot of different areas where the Chinese have become the key international intermediary. I saw the I read obscure things, I'm sorry to say, but if you watch the cobalt market in Katanga, in the Republic of the Congo, they've had a major problem recently, and so there's been a shutdown of one of the major cobalt mines. So it's not getting to China. It's Chinese owned. Cobalt goes there. That's what goes into a lot of the new essential technologies like your Tesla. And so as a result, there's this reverberations going through the international system that's going to make it much more complicated for us to deal strategically in the same way that what I think was very simple with the Soviet Union, to try to deal with the Chinese presence in terms of what it is. And a lot of that, as I say, is third industrial revolution driven and of course, melding into the fourth as well. Is that scary enough, Dan?
That's scary enough. I didn't know what a fax machine was. Thanks so much. It was amazing. Thank you very much. So Mark, thanks for being here. You were in the Obama administration. You worked for Senator Menendez in a past life as well. And you were Senate confirmed as the U.S. representative, the U.S. executive director to the Inter-American Development Bank. That's like being the U.S. ambassador to the Inter-American Development Bank. So one of the legitimate questions that the Obama administration is asking is, how do we ride herd on these institutions where we have influence and we own shares? How do we make sure they're actually being force multipliers for stuff we want them to do, as opposed to whatever the tax-free, unaccountable bureaucrats want to do? That's kind of the first question. I think the second question is, we put all this money into these things, and these guys are pretty well paid, and they send us a postcard, or they send the U.S. executive director a postcard once in a while about what they're up to. How do we make sure that we're getting a bigger piece of the contract action since we've put all the money in? Why aren't we getting more commercial business out of these things? So could you answer those two questions for me? And thanks for being on this. And you're also an affiliate with CSIS, and I'm thrilled you're here. Good to see you.
Great. Thanks, Dan, and thanks to everyone else. Those are two common questions that come up. You know, we're putting all this money into this international organization. What do we get out of it? And there's a lot of business that's coming out of this organization, and how can we get a bigger piece of that business? So they're common questions, but I would sort of go back to Les's question and others, that we have to think about this. What are the strategic interests of the United States? What are we getting out of this organization, and what are we putting into it? So I'm going to start with what are we getting out of the organization? $14 billion annually of financing for projects in Latin America, energy, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. You guys all know the gig. $3 billion of that is private sector financing. The other 11 is sovereign financing. $100 million in grant support, $200 million to Haiti, single largest donor in Haiti, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 95% of that, I would say, is squarely within the U.S. interests. Regardless of the party that's in power. I served in the Obama administration. I overlapped into the Trump administration a year and a half. This is all stuff that we like and that is benefiting us. And I would think about this foreign aid. So a little definitional point, Dan. You know, we talk about foreign aid. I'm thinking of the 70 countries rather than the 30. I think we use the examples of the 30 because that's sort of a lot of times where there's glaring and or highly political dynamics that are at play. But when we talk about the review, I think we're generally referring to the 70. And we're generally referring to, you know, poorer countries that are trying to make it on their way, and what is our best way to partner strategically with those countries. So when we say partner strategically, that's the part that gets me up when we say, well, why don't we cut these programs? Well, if the programs from the beginning were not a handout and they were a strategic partnership, that just because there's a political kerfuffle doesn't mean the strategic partnership is no longer valid, and we're still not getting what we want out of that money. So I think we need to be a lot more careful when we say, hey, how do we cut this? Because this was for us anyways from the beginning. It's not for them. When we see things that are for them, we're probably talking about the 30 countries. We're probably talking about untethered budget support, military arrangements.
To something,
other
somebody
kinds
like Haiti or Afghanistan.
of dynamics. So Haiti's a little trickier, but Afghanistan, yes, I would certainly put on that list. So what do we get out of the IDB? 95% squarely within our interest. The other 5%, I mean, we could quibble over it, but the vast majority of the work, and I'll speak to the work of the IDB alone, not the other MDBs. This is a modern development enterprise with highly capable U.S. and sort of top degrees in other countries, educated experts in their field that spent decades in the private sector and decades on the ground doing this work. So we're not talking about this old antiquated bureaucracy where they're sitting and having sort of white tablecloth lunches every day and enjoying kind of the development quagmire. These are people that are getting stuff done. So what does the U.S. what does the U.S. role in that? So we have a 30% share in the Inter-American Development Bank, 3 times larger than the next largest share, 10%, then it goes into single digits. We're the only country with a veto at the governor's level. We drive
So we can stop stupid things from happening.
at the governor's level only, not projects. We can, however, with our sort of informal offices and good offices, we can influence those projects very significantly within the process of the bank. Because they're in Washington, D.C., we have yet another set of linkages and engagement with the U.S. government at every level on a daily basis. I think that's good. To me, we get a tremendous amount out of that bank. Okay, so now what do we pay for it and how do we get more out of it? What do we pay for it? Last year, next year, the year after that, the year before, last year, the year before that, zero. All those years combined, zero. Money goes into MTBs in chunks, so you got to look at decades because it goes into capital increases. Okay, so let's look at the last 15 years. Divide the last 15 years, all sources, all spigots, all functions within the Inter-American Development Bank. The net cash outflow from the U.S. Treasury, $60 million a year.
6-0.
6-0. Hold with me these numbers and remember that one. 700 Americans who work in the IDB. Those Americans all pay taxes. If you're a dual citizen in the IDB, you're considered American. Those Americans pay taxes. Every year, those taxes go into the U.S. Treasury. Add up all those taxes every year on average for the last 15 years, $60 million. So there you have a net zero relationship with the U.S. Treasury. Add on to that $150 million of business because the bank is on 14th in New York and they buy lawyers
Every year.
services. Every year.
$150 million a year
dollars
every
in
year.
business. So take whatever tax multiplier you want off of that. This thing makes money for the United States government. So it makes money for the U.S. Treasury. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking all the hard questions and the same things with respect to impact and sort of nuance and sophistication. Fine. But that conversation has to start with this is a money maker for us. So any conversation about pulling away shares is equivalent to sort of, selling your 5 shares in Google in 2001. And so
That'd be a
doesn't make
dumb,
any
let's
sense
agree that was a
whatsoever.
dumb idea, right? That'd be a
Absolutely
really dumb idea.
And so I think we need to be less apologetic and a lot more forceful with respect to the values of these banks within the system. And we talk about a foreign aid review. The MDBs are often talked about in a different pot because it's funded through Treasury, which is a conversation that could and should be had if there's any significant review, because the bifurcation of the account structure leads agencies like Treasury to look at things in one day in one set of offices and agencies like AID to do the same. So there's a stovepipe nature of the conversation that I think is not helpful to the overall look of U.S. foreign assistance.
Yeah, let me just interrupt you for a second. I completely agree with that. We have a dual hat at the Asian Development Bank. The Asian Development Bank Executive Director is also ambassador rank. They're actually they're called ambassadors at the Asian Development Bank. I actually think every U.S. Executive Director should be dual-hatted at the ambassador rank. Therefore, they would have a dotted line tied to the State Department. The Asian Development Bank ambassador meets with the State Department and has much more of some connectivity. So I think this is a very important point. I completely agree with you, Mark.
The last piece to answer your question, Dan, on the business. So how do U.S. private companies get more of the pie of the $14 billion of infrastructure and other investments that are going into Latin America? That's been a conversation for a long time that's been very hard, both to get the data, because what we're talking about is country X is letting a contract for activity X. It's on their systems. The bank is working with those systems, but it's on those government systems. So, there's subcontracts and other reporting that makes it hard to gather the data, but the short story is U.S. construction company and infrastructure company take over those operations is very small, single-digit percentages, and has not been able to move significantly over the decades. So is that bad? Well, I don't think so. To be honest, I'm not worried about it because I don't see that as a giant strategic opportunity for those firms in the U.S., and they haven't seen it as a giant strategic opportunity such that they came to my offices and say, how do we want to do this? There's some of them that are curious and they want to look it out. At the end of the day, I think what we found was that they're simply not cost competitive. If you're going to build a road in Haiti, the Dominican construction firm is going to do it better, faster, cheaper. Better is another question, but you know,
Faster,
I'm all
cheaper,
pro-US, all the way.
cheaper.
Labor costs, economies of scale, and infrastructure that is physically on the same continent make them much more competitive to go for those contracts. So I'm not preoccupied. Again, I think we need to, not be distracted by that particular shiny detail that's not super enthusiastic about the U.S. and look at the other glaring details that are very, very much pro-U.S. The ambassadorial rank at the IDB.
You're up for
I think
that.
having that connection to the State Department is a good way to formalize the work with the State Department. I had no issue with State. They were very sort of receptive and great relationships across the board. Internally to the bank, if they treated me any better as a U.S. executive director, it would have gone to my head like permanently. I think I can get out of this in the next 10 years. But I think that the respect and the deference with respect to U.S. interests and U.S. development approach within, I would speak for the IDB, is better than I would have ever imagined. And I think we need to stop being worried that this is some sort of rogue set of actors that are not part of our
that are operating,
that are operating outside of our cycle.
Mark, I would argue that the MDBs are a force multiplier of a Western form of globalization. They use American law or British law for all their contracts and rules. They use the American dollar for everything they do. All their technical people, 99% of the people have been trained in the United States at a PhD or a law degree. I think that's probably true, or have an MBA. The working language in all these organizations is English. So now I do fear that if, and I also think that there's broadly, they may speak in, they may have kind of, they may want to kind of demonstrate some space with the United States, but they're in essence a force multiplier. And it's like you said, I think they're 95% of the time they're with us, and 5% it's quibbles. I agree with that. I do think the other thing we don't fully appreciate here in the United States is that especially regional development banks have a form of moral authority and moral power and persuasion that we don't appreciate here in Washington. I saw this when General Kelly invited me to Southcom. He invited me, he was in uniform, he had 4 stars, he stood up and said, I want you to come to Miami. It was like George Patton asking me to do something. Of course I was going to say yes. So I went, and there were senior leaders from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and President Moreno, the head of the Inter-American Development Bank, was at this meeting in Miami. Maybe some of you were there at this meeting, but they all have different perspectives. They had different points of view. They're coming from different political persuasions. They all stopped and listened with great intent and seriousness and with respect to what the head of the IDB said. It's much better if the IDB says something and más o menos is kind of 95% kind of where we are than if an ambassador, a U.S. ambassador. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Absolutely. I mean, again, the bang for the buck that we would get were we to sort of put in more money onto that is extraordinary. And like I said, 95% squarely within our interest. The risk is, and this is where I think the conversation is going, is what does the new agency within the U.S. mean? My view on that is we're trying to kind of insource some of the work that organizations like the IDB and other MDBs, frankly, do better now, and I suspect we'll be able to do that better over time, so I'm skeptical of the insourcing. But the second piece is, if we don't fund banks like the IDB,
other people will do it.
Other people will do it, or they.
And you can take a wild guess who the other people will be. I can give you a hint.
We have a governor's level veto at the IDB, so we control the size of the IDB in effect. So what we will do is not necessarily allow for others to put in, but we will force that bank to be smaller than market forces want it to be. Therefore, other organizations will crop up and grow. We've seen that already. The CAF, other regional development banks,
where the Chinese have said, "Hey, I'd like to put money into the CAF
infrastructure bank."
Okay.
All those things are elements and areas where if a country wants financing, they're going to want to work with the U.S. 19 times out of 20. And if the U.S. isn't there or the IDB isn't there, they're going to have to go somewhere else. So I think we max out the money that we throw at the MDBs as a competitive strike against those banks and functions. While legitimate as they may be, the U.S. voice in there is zero. The U.S. voice in the IDB is 30%. So my money is on
You're going with door number 2.
go where we have a voice and a vote, and where we know that the operations are happening within
So
our interest.
is it a policy, is it a good policy just to say, don't take Chinese debt, and without offering an alternative? Is that a good idea? Probably not, right?
I
Can
would
we agree
phrase
that's a
that in
bad
the
idea?
positive and invest where those investments are providing returns for U.S. interests writ large. And I think if that's the question, the IDB is a no-brainer in terms of
Okay,
investment.
so there's gonna be story time with Dan. So several years ago, in the G20 in 2010, there was a decision made that we were going to make some shifts in the shares of the IMF. This is a super obscure topic. And we're going to give a little bit more shares to the Chinese. The Europeans were going to take a little bit of a hit, and it was going to cost us a couple $100 million because of some accounting stuff. Super obscure. Most people don't know what the IMF does. I'm not sure how many members of Congress really know what the IMF does or what it stands for. It's not the IMF from Mission Impossible. If you've seen the Mission Impossible movies, there's no called IMF. It's the other IMF, right? So there were 19 members of the G20 said, this is a good idea, we're going to do this. This was in 2010. So then we decided to have a political dysfunctional moment because the Obama administration, the Treasury Department didn't do a very good job. It required, because there's very low educational level at the Congress, and there's no constituency that goes and lobbies for the IMF and rejiggering the shares of the super obscure, super boring, eye glaze over topic. It required the Secretary of the Treasury to do, small groups of 5 or 10, have them over for breakfast. We did this in the Reagan administration for other sorts of super stultifying and super obscure weird things. But the Secretary of the Treasury and the Obama administration at the time didn't want to do that. And there had been some bad blood between the Obama administration and the Republican-controlled Congress. So there was lots of pointed fingers and who was to blame, but for 5 years, we couldn't get this something called IMF quota reform done. So during that time, the Chinese said, I've got $2 trillion with a T in the bank. To hell with you guys. They probably use stronger language than that, or how you ever say that in Chinese. I'm going to start my own baseball game over here. I'm going to take my bat and ball and go home. I'm going to create this thing called the AIIB, where I'm going to have voice and vote, and I'm going to create this thing called the New Development Bank. And so, you guys, and so it took us 5 years. 5 years. And so in the past, 20 years ago, we'd have said, hey, world, we're the global superpower. You need to just also hit pause for the next 5 years while we work out our political dysfunction. So my message is political dysfunction and unmovement when other people, there's a vast majority of people against us, it has consequences. And so we can't just say to the world, look, we've got this political dysfunction. You don't understand. It's going to take us 5 years to come to a conclusion about tiny shifts in shares. That has consequences today. So I think, would you agree with that, Mark?
I would. Let me add another consequence. During that entire time, with IMF quota being a giant reform in the Department of Treasury, that sent a chill over the congressional engagement between the Department of Treasury and the Congress. So when somebody like me from the IDB says, hey, I think we got a strategic opportunity, I just need $20 million
for something else.
For something really important within Latin America and the Caribbean, say, I don't know, Central American sort of violence prevention programs.
Yeah, and
or
say the Northern
economic
Triangle where
development of
people
it.
are coming up, or they're drug-controlled gangs
Exactly.
or something like that.
And the answer was, we've got equities on the IMF reform, and we need to focus on those. So we don't.
So no, don't go up to the hill right now because we're only focused on this.
Absolutely. We don't think about, when we put our attention on one thing, the chill that it sends over those other things. And those other things may not be, at that moment, the most important thing, but they're certainly strategic and smart and in our interests. And so I think that's one of the areas, and when you get into the kind of the question of the review, when you look at the Treasury International Affairs budget being stovepipe outside of the State Department's assistance programs and USAID assistance programs, it allows this sort of small turf prioritization to crowd out other things that if you look across assistance to the Latin America and the Caribbean, which writ large is about $3 billion a year. And so I'm asking for $20 million for $3 billion. This is silly. And to Dan's point, you fight 5 years over $200 million. At some point, sort of do the math, this becomes ridiculous. And so we need to think about the investments in the timelines and how much kind of blood and treasure are we going to put in terms of fighting for those, and then look at what we're getting out of them.
Okay, this group has been very, very patient. I do want to just put it to this group, one, if everyone's got an answer to this, because I think one of the questions on the table is, this foreign assistance stuff, I don't think it really works. I've read some of the reports, and I think some of it actually may be back in the Cold War. I think some folks who are approaching this review are saying, I've read some of the economists that say that foreign aid doesn't really work, and I think I'm buying that. And I think some of it, Rich Bissell, is during the Cold War, during great power competition in the past, we made foreign assistance decisions based on who was with us. And, there was a thing called ESF. ESF was Economic Support Funds. That's in essence, highfalutin walking around money for for us to do stuff with the good guys, who we consider the good guys, so that they don't go with the bad guys. And so there were some times we made some decisions like we're going to help the dictator in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we didn't necessarily like what that person did, and maybe some of the money ended up in a Swiss bank account, or it was in the Philippines. They said, well, we're with this guy Marcos because he's with us and he doesn't like communism. So is there, so I think some of the bad rap on aid is kind of a hangover from the Cold War, where some of this was walking around money for our guys. So, and that's not all of it. I mean, there's been tons of research, and there's been 20 or 25 years of thoughtful work about where assistance does work. I think sometimes the aid community hasn't been as honest about when it hasn't worked as where it has worked, but I believe it does work. But I would welcome any of the panelists to say, where does assistance work or where does it not work? Because I think one of the operating premises is a lot of the stuff is just money down a rat hole. Does anyone have a reaction to that?
Thanks. I mean, I'm going to go all the way on one side on this. I mean, I think, I hope there's somebody in the room that thinks that foreign aid is money down a rat hole, because I would love to hear from folks on that. I suspect there's nobody in the room that shares that view, because
if anyone shows up at a meeting like this, they're probably not in that camp.
Absolutely.
But,
and so we end up talking to ourselves about this, and we keep
but it's really
asking this
comfortable
question,
talking to ourselves.
How does this stuff work? I've never seen that kind of hand-wringing and anxiety on the defense community side when they go up to Congress and say, I need another $300 billion for U.S. security. They're not saying, and we think that with that $300 billion, these are the units of security that are going to come back to the American people. Then on the congressional side, they don't question, well, how many units of security am I going to get for every dollar of investment in this effort? So I'm all for being scientific and honest and legit, and I think this community of people wants to make sure that their work has an impact. Yes, yes, yes. And we can be clever with respect to how we message this and simply argue that this is working and it is having an impact, and we can do more of that. And we have to be smart about that, but I think it's not smart, frankly, to continue this sort of examination publicly with respect to the impact of foreign assistance. Of course it works. Now, I'm talking about the 70 countries. The 30 countries, you're in a different ballgame, and if that's really more political assistance, couched as foreign assistance, that's someone else's definitional point.
Right. I could
highlight.
make an argument that we put $1 billion a year collectively through the Inter-American Development Bank, the United States, and others into Haiti. Partially because we don't want that, we in essence keep that country on life support because the geostrategic and the political consequences in this country of a full collapse of Haiti aren't acceptable. And so we're willing to kind of keep them on life support because if you will recall, in 1992, there were 100,000 Haitians were coming to Florida, and that was deemed as there was a whole series of issues that came up as a result of that. So I believe you could make the argument that people say, well, why aren't things being fixed in Haiti? But when people look closer at it, you could argue that the reason we're in Haiti is we don't want it to collapse.
So I'm not going to cite an example of where aid works, but what I will say is I'm firmly on the side of those who advocate that we should be encouraging more congressional member and staff junkets.
More junkets.
Hey, I don't
This
know
is the
old
More
word
Junkets
junket?
Caucus.
That's what people like Drew Pearson and Jack Anderson used to put in their columns about all these people taking fancy trips abroad. Because if they go and see programs, if they are briefed in the field about these programs, 98% come back believing that actually it does have very strong impact.
Okay, two examples of that. Richard Nixon, when he was a freshman member of Congress from California, was sent as 200 members of Congress went to visit Europe after World War II to understand the damage that had been done after World War II because they were considering something called the Marshall Plan. There was 100 hearings held by the Senate and the House combined before the Marshall Plan was approved. And the reason it was approved was the invasion or the coup in Czechoslovakia. So yes, there was humanitarian reasons, but we did it because of great power competition. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think a second example is Congressman Yoho, who is a member of the Tea Party caucus. He's from Florida, and he went with his spouse to Africa, and saw that the Chinese were eating our lunch, and said, we ought to do something about this. And so that's another example of a modern example of this. So I'm completely in agreement. I want to give a homework assignment to the aid community. I think the successes of Taiwan and South Korea are tremendous successes. But one of the pushbacks you get from critics is that's so in the past. I love the Plan Colombia example, and I think that's one we should continue to use. But we need additional stories that we can tell, because I think we often use sort of either stuff from a long time ago, or we use some of the health ones that are easily measurable, because I think the health stuff is sort of, I vaccinated so many kids and this is what happened. But a lot of the softer stuff is harder to measure. There are ways to measure it, and there are people who do this for a living, who do measurement and evaluation for a living. But one of the, I think, the sins of the aid community is that much of us talk in technocratic gobbledygook that Earth people cannot understand. And I think it's one of our problems. Anyone else want to comment? Does this aid work?
I'll take that. Yeah, sure. Aid works. Aid can work better. There's a lot of things that we could do better in the community, but yeah, it has worked. We haven't seen a difference. There's loads of examples that we probably could do more to get out. But one recent one that we were just talking about on Monday was the Jordan MCC project. Helping get water to an area that desperately needed it, which is not health. There's lots of great. I agree. Lots of great health.
And sorry, just a minute on that. Just on Jordan, I think we're in Jordan partially because we don't want Jordan to explode. Jordan is one of our best allies. They're hosting something like 1 million refugees from Syria. So it's sort of not high on our list for Jordan to blow up anytime soon.
Right. We want them. I actually visited that Jordan MCC water project when I was pregnant with my middle kid, and it was amazing. It was like one of those things where you go, oh, this is a good idea. There's all these refugees here. You can see that people don't have water. There's water tanks and people carrying water. I mean, the whole thing was very, very logical. So yes, and Carolyn, our intern with Tetra Tech, did a review last week and found that every single president since World War II has reviewed foreign aid. So they've been looking at foreign aid before U.S. aid was even created. And so this is a kind of a natural thing, but every kind of generation or every administration is facing a different international context. So we have to kind of redefine what are our goals. Are we meeting those goals? How should we change, and what can we improve? Because the system can improve. There's a lot of transaction costs and inefficiencies that we could improve in our system. I mean, I don't know if anyone's been in a system that couldn't be improved, so that's certainly a thing. On the ambassador rank thing, I just wanted to point out the reason we have the ADB as an ambassador rank was security reasons. There was security concerns in the Philippines, and at the time, to give the person who led our work in the ADB protection, we gave them ambassador rank. But going forward, any administration could send over a title and say with the rank of ambassador, and that could be a done deal. So it's not a very complicated thing to do. And the last thing on U.S. companies with Mark's, I would totally push back on Mark. I think it's absolutely critical that U.S. companies get work with the development banks, and it may not be to improve the projects or to do them faster or cheaper, but it is really, really important if we think about there needs to be a constituency for the development banks.
We probably need to fund foreign and commercial service officers in enough countries because of the way in which these projects are ultimately decided aren't necessarily decided in Washington at the Inter-American Development Bank. It's in some Ministry of Infrastructure in Paraguay. And so having a foreign and commercial service officer at the embassy who could work with American companies might be a way to do that, right?
That's certainly one of them. And because you were talking about like the obscurity of the IMF and there weren't people who cared. Like if nobody cares, if no one has any skin in the game with the development banks, why do we think that there would be support for them?
Okay, so thank you, thanks, Emily. So Ambassador Olson, I know you wanted to comment on this, but I want to ask you something else. You were kind enough to work with me on a paper on Pakistan and the IMF, because the IMF is going to seek the Pakistan government is seeking perhaps assistance for the 100th time or something from the IMF. And so we just had an earlier conversation about IMF. Pakistan's a complicated relationship for us. At the same time, in the last 5 or 10 years, they've taken on a lot more Chinese debt. So one of the things I think that people in the U.S. government are thinking about is, okay, why should we give aid, or why should multilateral institutions that we have some influence over give money when they're packed to the gills with Chinese debt? Are we in essence the American plumbers and carpenters who pay taxes, who then we use to pay for these things like the IMF? Are we in essence American taxpayers are bailing out Chinese debt holders, the Chinese are becoming sort of the drug dealers of international finance, kind of easy money on easy terms. Are we in essence sort of enabling their behavior? And so that was a question we kind of grappled with in that paper. And I'm sure that if I was the U.S. government, I'd be grappling with the issue of why should I be giving aid to these folks who are taking easy money on bad and sketchy terms from the Chinese?
Yeah, well, it's an excellent question. I would just say in the question of Pakistan, in some ways it's a good example of the overall debt trap diplomacy question, but in some ways it's not. Pakistan's at the official level, Chinese debt accounts for about 10% right now of Pakistan's debt portfolio, and as we pointed out in our paper, Pakistan's economic problems and need to go to the IMF. 21 programs to date, and two in the last 10 years. Are home driven, and they have to do with currency exchange rates and
it's not Chinese debt, it's just kind of bad housekeeping, bad economic policy on the part of the Pakistani government.
Exactly, and
So don't blame the Chinese.
and a political system in Pakistan that kind of drives overspending during elections. Not the only country in the world where that happens. And so an IMF program almost naturally follows a national election. But it is a good example in the sense that this will be a high-profile case. And it will be significant, I think, in terms of the size of the program that will probably be needed, probably 12 to 15 billion, although the Pakistanis have succeeded in getting some money from the Saudis and perhaps from the Chinese.
Right. So this is the point of if we can't get help from the IMF, do we want people saying I'm going to go to the Chinese so they can play crypto IMF instead of going to the real IMF?
Yeah, and I think that where it's probably likely to come out, my guess is that in the past the U.S. has used exercised its influence through the executive director to make the programs in some sense easier for Pakistan for political reasons, and I think that's very unlikely to happen now. I think you can expect very tough conditionality. It will be a case of letting the IMF be the IMF.
So we agreed on the issue of if we did do an IMF package to them, there were some larger geopolitical issues we had to consider, but we had to provide tougher asks on them if we were going to do it, right?
Yeah.
That's where we came down.
Yeah, exactly. And if I can just turn to the question of the utility of aid, at the risk of being the skunk on the panel, let me just say that I think that the current national security strategy that you alluded to at the opening, it's a very good document. It talks about strategic complacency and how the U.S. has had strategic complacency since the 1990s, and I think that's actually something I would agree with. And I think our assistance programs, in fact, are probably the prime example of strategic complacency. That is to say, there's no overarching strategic coherence to what we're doing in the assistance field as it relates to foreign policy objectives. And I think Les was alluding to this, that there may be an opportunity right now to be thinking about these issues, especially with the topic today, great powers, that there's a moment where we may be able to think more about strategic coherence and how assistance fits into that. Finally, just on the question of ambassadorial rank, since I have one.
You have one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the good thing about being an ambassador is people answer your calls, but
You look like an ambassador too. I mean, you could be like, we had a movie. I would cast you as an ambassador.
it's the pocket scarf.
I love it. I love it.
Thank you. So anyway, but on this question, when you're a bilateral ambassador overseas, my experience has been that if you attempt to reach out to the executive director at a multilateral bank or one of the the Washington-based institutions, put on your Kevlar because the next day Treasury will be calling you asking you what you're up to, and so I'm all in favor of dotted lines. If the way to do that is the ambassadorial title, great. I think it probably would require a little bit more than that.
Fair enough. Okay, you all been super patient. Let's get 2 or 3 questions from this thoughtful audience. Hands high, please. Okay, this gentleman. Come on, let's have a little gender balance here, folks. Come on. And my friend up here. Okay, these 3. Okay, yep. Name, rank, serial number, short question.
Chris O'Donnell. And where do I get a poppy from?
I asked my friends from the Canadian Embassy over there.
Okay. Chris O'Donnell, Development Essentials. Thanks for setting up the event today. Glad we can ask legitimate questions on foreign assistance. Here's mine. Saw a GAO report on strategies in the U.S. government. 54 strategies in 20 agencies doing foreign assistance. If we look at USAID, 25% of the money is obligated in the U.S., 75% in the field. They have these country strategies, but 65 of them aren't done. And so when there's no strategy, it's kind of, the money's being spent without a strategy. So whoever yells the loudest gets their project funded. So required by law, these country strategies, what do you think are the obstacles in place or that need to be overcome in order to kind of put these country strategies in place?
So how do we get our act together better on this? Fair enough. Okay, my friend here, Manchester Trade. Mr. Black Sweater, sorry. Manchester Trade. I've got a soft spot for my friend at Manchester Trade.
Living up to the rules, I'll be really short. It is a pleasure to see Nilmini here, not only because her work with Power Africa, but also because she set the basis for the BILL program. I am absolutely confused. The BILL program is exciting.
This is the new OPIC on steroids.
That has absolutely the worst name I ever heard. You know what I mean?
What,
Who knows
Build
what
Act?
its name? What is it? Better use of investment leading development. Yeah, but that's okay. That's the name you would come up with. But seriously, that has $60 billion. Significant. That's supposed to be base capital, but you're supposed to be attracting investments, private sector, development banks, and so on. It's supposed to be aimed not only at helping your country decide what it wants, but also in better enabling us to compete with Africa. This whole discussion, I haven't had one person mention it. And to
the
me,
BUILD Act, or the new,
the BUILD Act,
yeah.
exactly, whatever it means. And to me, that strikes me as a much better way to go, quote, than the aid level. I mean, aid levels, NGOs, we can deal with it. We can do all kinds of good things. I won't say it's a rat hole. I'll say it's a feel-good kind of program. But isn't the BUILD Act the way to go in the future? Isn't it really the way to
That's a good one. Okay. No, that's it. Sorry. Sorry. Yep. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'm Cheryl Morden with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, an international financial institution that the administration currently has zeroed its contribution for. Dan,
Are we the largest contributor, though? Are we one of the largest
We're
contributors
down to
to it?
10% share.
Okay. Who's
Still
bigger?
higher. No, we're still the highest.
Okay,
but I say we. I should say the U.S.
So the Trump administration said zero, but Congress gives you money, and we're still the biggest donor.
so far, and we haven't pledged. So.
I always ask these things because I love the United Nations, I love multilateral. Can you be clear when you say this?
No, it's a bargain. I mean, going to some of Mark's
Right.
comments for
Right.
10% share rather than 20, 25.
And how much does
is
China have, by the way?
About overall share. I can tell you they're the third largest contributor to the current replenishment.
As long as they're not at 10%, I'm okay with it.
No, but they're coming up. So thinking about your question about how to compete and how to collaborate, suggests to me that it's important that the U.S. is not only clear about its objectives, but is clearer about where it fits within the overall development ecosystem. And, we as a multilateral organization are constantly scrutinized by our member states and with a strong demand that we clearly define our strategic comparative advantage. You know, what is our specific and unique value added, and therefore how do we fit in with all the others, so to improve development effectiveness overall. And it just seems to me this isn't a question that gets put to the U.S. Does the U.S. think about what is its specific, you know, what does it bring to the table uniquely and specifically? You know, maybe it's just the geopolitical muscle behind being in collaboration with the U.S. or potential links to the U.S. economy, but it just seems to me like this isn't necessarily a question that the U.S. is asking itself, nor is Congress asking the administration, what is the U.S. unique comparative advantage when it comes to development.
I love that. Thank you very much. That prompts a whole bunch of things. Let me just react to two things that have been come up both from Cheryl and my friend from Manchester Trade, and then I want to, anybody here on the panel wants to react to any and all, I would do so. So I think, Cheryl, I think there's one of the things I want to encourage everyone to think about is the bilateral aid review and the multilateral aid review that the Brits did, DFID. That's twice have done it. It's a center-right government, has twice done this in the UK. So if you were going to do a U.S. government review, you would do well by looking at the bilateral and multilateral aid reviews. Now, I think as you probably got, EFED probably got a couple of these letters written in very nice, in the Queen's English, that said, hey, we've got some really smart people in the UK government taking a look at, tell me what your value add is, what your value added contribution is, how do you fit in this? And they said, if you can answer that question properly, I'll give you more money. And if you can't answer that question, I'm going to cut your funding. So in a couple instances, they actually cut funding and plussed it up based on sort of those questions. And I was at the World Bank group when we got one of those letters and put the fear of God in my colleagues. And so I think if I was the government, the U.S. government right now and doing something like that, I would call our friends across the pond and leverage our special relationship to get some feedback about that. I do think that's the first point I'd say. The second is, I do think this is an interesting question, which is like, what is our value that we bring to the table? I think we have many things. I think science, technology, innovation is one. I think our values is another. And I think our higher education system is another. We don't fully leverage it. I'm super biased about that, but I think that's a really good question. I don't think we fully think about that. Let me just comment on the BUILD Act. I think the development finance is the future. If you have trouble sleeping at night, I've written a number of papers about development finance. But if I would argue, I'd bet y'all a steak dinner in about 5 years' time. I'm gonna maybe it's 7 years, so I don't have to buy you guys the steak dinner. But I think that the lines of development finance enabled investments versus traditional ODA, they're going to cross. If you look at if you look at from the year 2000, it was something like $60 billion of ODA and about $10 billion of DFI enabled investments. By 2015, it was something like $80 billion in DFI-enabled investments and $135 billion in ODA. I would argue those lines are going to cross at some point. So I think it's a big part of the future. We're asking DFIs to do a lot more. I think it's great that we got the BUILD Act passed. What you're talking about is, in essence, the Congress has given let's think of it as OPIC on steroids. OPIC some new authorities, some new tools, which we've advocated here for at CSIS for 8 years. If you go back and look at a paper we did in 2011 about this, and you look at the BUILD Act, there's for some reason a lot of similarities. But in essence, that 60 billion number is the credit card limit. That says, and right now OPIC does about $4 billion a year in investments. I don't know what the AIIB is going to do when it's fully operational, but it's going to be multiples of $4 billion a year. So I think it's an important part of the development future, but the BUILD Act alone is not a strategy to counter China. We need if we want to do great power competition, if our response is, I'm giving you the BUILD Act, I think that was an impetus for getting the BUILD Act done. We need a much larger strategy. I think some of the points that Ambassador Olson was referring to earlier. So thank you for raising that. Okay, I want to hear from each of the panelists. You can react to anything that you've heard or anything that your fellow panelists have said, and we'll wrap it up. Ambassador Olson, I'll start with you.
I really don't have any response to the question, so
Okay.
I'll pass. Thanks.
Okay. Neil Minnie?
I will take BUILD Act. We've been talking about it a lot lately, and I think that when we look at foreign aid or foreign assistance, I think the big BUILD Act will be one of the important fingers. I'm not sure if it will be a thumb, but it'll be an important finger for foreign aid. It just won't be we'll need the other tools, because there's certainly going to be countries where facilitating private investment isn't exactly what we need to be doing. We might need to be doing, humanitarian relief or refugee support in different ways. So, but I think it's a really exciting tool. I think very well it was like a legislative miracle that it got passed and has such great bipartisan support. And I'm really excited about its potential. I've participated in a few roundtables with people from OPIC on it, and I know they've been doing outreach around the development community, the investment community, kind of just a lot of different stakeholders to do it. So I think there's a lot of potential with it, and I'm very hopeful that it will make a difference. On the country strategies, like this is a holdover issue. It's generations of administrations haven't finished these country strategies. I remember once when I was a Senate staffer, we rushed to Sri Lanka to do our report before the country strategy came out on Sri Lanka. And we did this report on recharting U.S. strategy towards Sri Lanka after the war. And, I'm not sure the country strategy is still done, right? So I think it's kind of a bureaucratic thing, like people in the institutions need to care about doing the country strategies in order for them to actually get them done. But obviously a strategy would make sense if we're trying to put big sums of money into countries.
Lester?
Real quick, let me just put in a vote for what USAID has done so far. At the beginning of this administration, there was a call for all agencies and departments to take a look at themselves and put forth reforms. USAID took that very seriously. Frankly, the State Department totally fumbled that opportunity. USAID is in a process of implementing those right now. They're working with Congress. Some of them are far-reaching. They're restructuring things. USAID has also developed Clear Choices, which actually is a kind of a coherent overall approach to the Indo-Pacific and to great power competition. State Department has not done similar work. This administration, again, it's schizophrenic. We need to see more of an effort from other agencies, from the White House, more of a coherent approach. It should include the BUILD Act. It should include other multilateral entities where the U.S. has a role. There are some good things happening in this administration. We need to push for more good things from other places.
Yeah, I think the BUILD Act is one of the great developments, not for what it may be in itself, because we don't know what it will be. It's going to need to be fleshed out and deciding really what it's going to do and who's going to be part of it. But just the fact it was done is very important because we've been living with what I call a straitjacket of the Foreign Assistance Act since 1961. Now, long ago, which is half the time between then and now, when I was using the Foreign Assistance Act, it was 4 volumes that thick. I understand it's now roughly 7 volumes. And if you try to work according to the Foreign Assistance Act in AID or any of the other agencies, your room for innovation, for change, for addressing new geostrategic opportunities is very limited. And it creates a set of professionals who are very good at doing that, of working within that, but it is not where AID should be, or any of the other agencies that are working within it. So I hope that what this is a sign of is that the stakeholders in this work are willing to kind of set aside the FAA to the extent they can, not try to revise it, because reviewing that would chew up a generation. Rather, just going out and passing the BUILD Act, passing something like an International Security Assistance Act, which, believe it or not, was put forth in 1970 by the Peterson Commission. And take these major sectors of the assistance work and change them for what we need vis-a-vis current strategic challenges.
Okay, Mark.
So on the smaller agencies and sort of U.S. shareholding, I think when the numbers are flying around and bullets, like the question is, do you want to be very visible and exposed, or do you want to duck and cover? And I think every agency has to think through that, but I don't know the particulars in terms of the question you asked. On the country strategies, I think people go to websites at USAID and they want to see what is the U.S. government assistance strategy with country X, and they want to see it in one document. That should be happening. There should be documents on there. I worked at AID, and we made a huge effort to finalize those documents. They're 5-year strategies. It's an interagency process. It should be relatively clear. There should not be 14 priorities. That's a management issue that DAS's office directors need to drive and finish and do. And when you have a fully completed organization with political mandates from the top that trickles down from politicals that lead, well-engaged career officers, you will get that. The Build Act, I think I would say, I think there's a grand irony in a bill that gestures for private sector engagement by expanding the size of government. So, there needs to be a reconciliation of the ambitions, which I fully agree with, and all the financing, yes, 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 yes. But you're telling me on the equity, and I'm being a little bit playful on this because the details are going to have to be hammered out. You're telling me that somebody with a U.S. government ID card is going to be making equity investment decisions about company X and country Y. We don't have those people in the government. And so as you talk about organizations, institutions, and we've all been around Washington a long time, worked along a lot of them, these are bodies that you need. You need physical humans with the expertise to carry this out. So I think the effort of looking at and then all of a sudden popping out with an OPIC on steroids, depending on how this plays out, may not have been the strategic sort of setback. What do we want to achieve? What resources do we have out there? And where do we throw the money and the people to make sure that those happen? The IFIs could be another resource for that. They do equity investments. We had a 5-year
Mark,
conversation around
it seemed to work really well when I was sitting here in the ivory tower. In theory, it worked great up here upstairs. So.
No, it's amazing how well things work in that context. No, I mean, just like MCC, right? I mean, all the ideas worked. There was sort of a big peak and a lot of enthusiasm. And from a perspective of messaging and kind of around this assistance community, it's a good thing to have a development conversation that's not a negative one happening. And to Nilmani's sort of, pushback on me with respect to the U.S. private companies, I actually agree with you, Nilmani, that would be a good thing to have a constituency for development, but it's not about necessarily the road getting built. The road could get built in different ways, but for building a constituency, absolutely.
Please join me in thanking the panel.